Listeners, you are in for a treat today as I sit down and have a conversation with Flozell Daniels Jr. He is a New Orleans native. He brings an expertise in public policy, community development, criminal justice reform, climate policy, transit equity, and asset development. He has a long history of building and making a difference in philanthropy. And in the South, he believes in equity, and it has been documented. He has the receipts, y'all. He has worked together and always believed that the fates of all Southern people are tied together. From his early work on equity and inclusion campaign covering Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, to his co-founding of Grantmakers for Southern Progress, he holds a long-standing commitment to building the South's infrastructure for justice and power. In this conversation, we talk about his leadership journey and the women who have supported him along the way. There has just been this climate of grief and loss. I was just talking with Toya, who was talking to me about Janine Lee and the work that she did. Is it in the Southeast?
Yeah, Philanthropy Southeast was her last position as CEO of Philanthropy Southeast, but she had an esteemed legacy in philanthropy, working for the Arthur Blank Foundation in Atlanta. Before that, the Ewing Marion Kaufman Foundation in Kansas City, the Southern Partners Fund, and really countless others. She was co-founder of Grantmakers for Effective Organizations, one of our best and most uplifted organizations. Just so many points of legacy inside of her history of philanthropy. And that's not counting, Chanda, the dozens and dozens of people she mentored and was a sort of a source of sage advice, a shoulder to cry on, and a quiet warrior who knew how to get work done inside of tough places. And so we are missing her both, God, emotionally, but also practically, if you know what I mean.
I do know what you mean. And I've encountered her, but I did not know her. But social media is a thing sometimes. And what it does do in moments such as this is it has an opportunity to illuminate the impact of one's life, because you get to see how people are honoring and posting and communicating their legacy. And so I got more of a sense of her in this time.
Absolutely. And, it's really interesting. Karen, one of her friends, Karen Miller, said, just, in putting the eulogy together, she said, I sent notes around, but I also went to social media and called the kind of things that people were saying about her, right? And so at Janine Services, she did a bit of a word cloud to say, here are the top 10 things we heard. And it was, things like love and integrity and all the things that we knew about Janine. And to your point, getting a chance to connect, even across social media, with others who I know I don't know, but who had the same experience with Janine that I did. And also recognizing that Janine sits amongst a litany, an entire community of Black women in philanthropy who have held up the space and have been the banner carriers for what it means to do this work well. And also, regrettably, what it means to have taken on too much, having to carry too much in this work.
All I could do is breathe through that comment because, I have not met you before, but Toya said we should have Flozell on the Centering Conversations and, on this women's series, right? This series
Right.
And she said, if there is someone that I think could align with what we're trying to communicate in this series, it would be Flozell. She said Flozell Ezekiel, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, she got a nickname for me.
Like, okay, but yeah, so.
I tell her all the time, I'm like, yes, I was raised in the church and I will take all of that.
Just so endearing. And Toya is a person that is a connector and an amplifier and a builder and a creator, and one of the women that have carried a lot and have done so much for so many of us in this space.
She is such a quiet source of brilliance. I have seen her when no one was looking, when there was no opportunity to be seen, do some of the most incredible, high integrity, thoughtful, and innovative work in the field. And she just goes about her business, doing what needs to be done, and also showing up when there, how do you say, when there has to be some corrective action. She has a strength about herself that belies her size and her quiet voice and how she shows up. She really is one of our anchors in the field.
Yeah, I tell people often that Toya has cemented herself squarely in my philanthropy journey. I met her when I was the CEO of an organization. Mm-hmm. And not long after I met her, I moved into philanthropy.
Yeah.
And she gave me a call. She welcomed me into the space. And she said, well, since you don't have no job yet, because I was in between, she said, I'm going to sponsor you to go to the Black Women in Philanthropy retreat.
Yeah.
Because you're going to need it.
That's right.
And I remember getting there, and I probably have said this story on this podcast before, but when I got there, really the agenda, right, for the week or the 3 or 4 days that we were together was around wellness.
Yeah.
So there was breathing exercises and there was meditation and all these things to like manage stress.
Yeah.
So I had just left a role thinking that this was the role that I was going to be managing stress, right? It was going to be less stressful. It was going to be less demand. And here I walk into an environment of Black women trying to manage stress, right? Like I just didn't know what to do with this. And so, to the point that you raised, right, carrying too much, I think that as I traveled down my tenure, which, has been about 7, 8 years in the field, I understand now, right? I need space to meditate and to breathe.
That's right.
Right? I understand better what those women, what we have been carrying in terms of working very hard to move organizational culture.
Yeah.
Working very hard to be seen in the work, and working very hard to navigate the expectations of community.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Yeah. And that's a big one we don't talk about, right? I think there's some more acknowledgement now about the stresses of the work with regard to, who your boss is, or if you have a board, who your bosses are, or with regard to how to manage teams or how complex the work is. We don't talk enough about community has a very sort of public facing expectation of us. And we very much want to live inside of what that expectation is and to show up for our people. And so when people say to me, you're in the privileged landscape of philanthropy, and this is a fact, Chanda, like there is a lot of privilege in these spaces that we get to be in for all kinds of reasons. There is also something really challenging if you care about the work. As I like to say, for real.
If you for real about the work, it is challenging. Can you articulate what the challenges are?
I think there are a number of things, but since the beginning of time, we have been Black folk, and I would say Black women in particular, and Black families have been at the root or sort of at the level of focus of oppression in a way that, if you really understand it, feels backbreaking, right? And so if you decide to do this work, right, I have an MBA, I could have gone off and done a bunch of other things and dealt with those things differently. But because folk like us choose to do this work and have the privilege to do it, what we also sit inside of is not only working with our own communities and families and chosen families to be a part of the work that is trying to upend powerful systems that are trying to kill us, to be clear. And being successful in many cases. And on top of that, having to manage our own experience with that in the world. I don't get to shut off the dangers that I think about with my daughter and my granddaughter, right? Just because it's the weekend. And and then we bring that into the work, and the work has more complexity and challenge from that perspective. We frequently work with people who are good people, but who are struggling with their own understanding about the dynamics of race or gender. We could talk about the patriarchy and how it upends all of our lives. And it creates a real challenge, and it has made me and others really think a lot more about what it means to care for ourselves and to be sustained in this work, and to get over the reflex that caring for ourselves does not mean that we're lazy, does not mean that we don't care about community, which is another reflex that I find myself having. Like if I take time off work, I'm thinking, oh, but there's something happening that I should be doing. My therapist is like, no, it's going to be there when you get back. Right?
Yeah, going to be there.
But these are long held reflexes that come from, our past legacies of, and current legacy of oppression, and feeling like we have to always stand in the gap. And doing so is exhausting and cost us something. And I think it is time for us to really take inventory of what that means, and what's the opportunity for us to both do the work and to do it well, and to also care for ourselves. My team said something really important last year at a staff retreat. They said, this is not just about self-care. They said, this is about community care. Mm. We can't care for ourselves if the whole community is not able to find a way to do the things that create care and resilience, and which has kind of become a bad word in Louisiana. But
talk about that word. Why is it a bad word?
Well, it's interesting. So this is 2024. So next year in 2025 will be the 20-year commemoration of Hurricane Katrina and Rita. And so much of the disaster was personal and was felt in our bodies and in our communities. And so much of the loss was substantial and disproportional in Black communities. And so much of the conversation, I used to run something called the Louisiana Disaster Recovery Foundation. And one of our major efforts was to build resilience, right? In all of our communities, right? Which explicitly meant Black and Brown communities in particular. We had a deep equity agenda. We did all of this amazing work. But in those conversations, resilience was centered. And people started to say, I'm tired of it. I'm tired of having to be resilient, because it means I have to weather this oppression and systemic racism and ineptitude, and lack of community representation, and all of the things that were making people's lives difficult. Mm-hmm. And what we were saying, because I include myself in it, I lost my home, all my family lost everything. What we were saying is that what we want are the conditions to change, so we don't always have to be resilient. And so in Louisiana, and I think this is the case other places around the country as well, but certainly in New Orleans or Louisiana, you will sometimes be in a community conversation and say resilient, and people will say, I don't want to hear it. I want to talk about how we're going to not have to weather these insults to our spirits and our bodies. That's what folks are really interested in.
Yeah, I feel that to my core, in this idea that we can weather anything that comes our way. Mm-hmm. And so it's, sort of the sayings on like, check on your strong friend, right? Because we're so used to weathering it, that we weather with ease. And I think that's one of the challenges when we get into these roles, is that we have developed the strength to withstand a lot. And to show up in ways that doesn't reveal the challenges that we're actually faced with. And so it creates a very strict box around us, right? Of protection that can be very challenging to do a number of things: take breaks, ask for help, leave roles that aren't for us.
Right. Yeah, there was a conversation recently, and you've seen this, Chanda, and you've talked about it with other guests on the show, on the podcast, where you see Black folk leaving philanthropy in droves, particularly Black women. And I had a conversation recently with someone who said, I can't believe so and so left this really important position where they were going to be able to leverage those resources for the well intentions of Black folk and others and do all this stuff. And I said, yes, I had that conversation with them up until the point that they said, but I'm not going to survive it. And just them knowing that there was that there was an analysis in their own spirit and an understanding of themselves that they wouldn't survive it felt like a moment of freedom. It felt like, oh, well, look at the progress we're making, that we understand these things in a different way maybe than our elders did, right? You know, if you look at Dr. King or Fannie Lou Hamer, all these people, this work took their lives.
Right.
Whether by bullet or by other circumstances, health, stress, and what have you. And not feeling like they could walk away from it or take a break and what have you in some cases. And so I'm actually glad that people are feeling like they can shift out of toxic spaces or spaces that don't serve them and their families. And we'll figure out how to, you know, get more people in the field and continue to do the work that we do.
I think that's right. And to make it more current, there are still people that are not surviving the work.
Today.
I
have a group of friends in the work, almost all of them Black women, by the way, which goes to just how we respond by gender sometimes. And we sort of tongue in cheek joke about how we frequently are making presentations or talking about the work and find ourselves just bursting into tears, Chanda. Right? As I'm talking to you, I could feel the emotion welling up just because this work is so intense. And the opposition, the enemy, the folks who are really intentionally creating the distress are operating at such high volume and with so many resources, it just feels frequently like it's impenetrable, or you know, like you're not sure you're going to be able to succeed. And so it really does take a lot of practice. It takes Ambassador James Joseph was one of my many mentors, and he would say to me, Flozell, cultivate hope all the time. It is a permanent practice. And it's something I am still struggling a bit with, Chanda, to practice, to be honest with you.
I go through times where the people that are sort of holding on to the system as it is, the ones that are actually creating a lot of harm, racial harm, gatekeeping.
Yeah.
I often wonder if they even fully understand the extent in which they're doing those things. Yeah. Because it's so much it's just the way it has been.
Yeah.
So even trying to have the conversations with folks that are well-intended tend to go nowhere.
Yeah.
And so do you think that there's sort of this intentional way of keeping people out and weathered? Or do you think that there is more opportunity for people that are holding those spaces to examine the system, right? Because it's become so personalized that it becomes polarized.
Yeah.
Right. So any advice to people that are navigating these spaces with people that are I got great intentions?
You know, I think there are a couple of things happening, right? One is I've learned over the years from my mentors that you have to be really careful when you get the privilege of standing in one of these spaces where there is power, where there is opportunity, that you don't become a part of what makes the system do harm. And to your point about it not being intentional, you know, we talk a lot about the distance between intentions versus actual harm. and having to acknowledge that. I think there is space for us to continue to do what we used to do. It feels like there was a bit of community-based political education about what your role was if you got to be one of the people who got to a position of power that would serve the interests of community, right? I'm 53 years old. I was born in 1970. And even as a child, I was made to understand that you're supposed to do a few things. You get well educated, you work hard, you become successful so that you can serve.
That's right.
The interest of your people and your community in whatever way that is. And it feels to me, Chanda, like we've gotten away from that level of community understanding, those agreements. I like to say we've lost some of our recipes. And so when people get into these positions, because of the oppressive nature of these systems, and because of the rewards that you get for being well behaved, for some people, it's really difficult to stand up inside of those systems and do the work that it takes to make sure that opportunity is created and made. Mm-hmm. And I really do think it's because we have not done the best job from a leadership development perspective of making sure that folks understand there is an expectation. And we don't want to do harm to you or your family, but we do want you to act in those spaces and places with some intentionality. I also don't think we've done a great job of helping each other understand what that looks like. Right. I was trained that there's an inside outside strategy. And when you're inside, you have to behave a certain way. When you're outside, you have to show up a certain way. Both of them require courage. And both of them require discipline. Mm-hmm. And I think there's some real opportunities for us to, in this space, there's sort of a lively space around Afrofuturism, and folks are talking again about being radical imaginaries and what does it mean for us to stand in the space of our elders and ancestors and their ability to create something out of nothing. I think that's an opportunity for us and to revisit this kind of courage and discipline necessary and matching it with our curiosity and imagination to make sure that we can get to the next level.
Do you think that we need better ways, better strategies of navigating, or do you think that it is survival? Right? Because I think the conflicting elements of that is, right? I need to take care of my family.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah, right.
I got more courage and I'm able to demonstrate in this place, because the more I demonstrate, the more harm comes my way, the more I put my family at risk, right? These are trade-offs that are being made.
Every day.
Every day.
Every day. I think you're right. And that's what I meant by inside and outside strategy. I think we have to make space for folk to show up when and how they can. I'll give you an example. I worked at Tulane University for 9 years, and it was one of the best and worst things that ever happened to me, right? If you will, I got a free graduate school education, a fantastic education. I had bosses and mentors on campus, people like Jean DeMore and Yvette Jones and others who were just amazing and who supported me in that work. And the work itself was so complex and mired with structural racism, because I had to deal with the legislature, I had to deal with powerful systems, I had to deal with a university that on one hand was taking really good care of me and my family, but that also couldn't manage to have any Black faculty in the business school where I spent 3 years getting a degree. And there's not a Black person in the building teaching a single thing. And not understanding what that did to me and like how I felt about that and why it mattered to other students and other staff members, for instance, right? And so we sit inside of those complexities. And what I did was, I wasn't out there burning the flag, the Tulane flag in effigy, or doing whatever, because that's not what I could do. But I certainly created opportunity internally for African American students and others through a scholarship program I ran. We would develop programs that were consistent with my values around criminal justice reform and expanding wealth and economic justice for Black and poor families. And I was able to show up that way. And I still had people who said to me, "You're over there in the ivory tower. You don't care about me. You don't care about us," right? And this is from, you know, the came from the Black neighborhood, the Ferret Street neighborhood, up the street from Tulane, where I was told I could not go on Tulane's campus as a kid. I would later find out that they had just integrated the campus the year I was born because a couple of Black women, one of whom would become one of my mentors, Pearlie Elway, had sued them for admission. And so, to your point, we sit inside of these complexities, and it is sometimes just survival. Just survival is enough sometimes.
And she sued them in the 1970s?
It was 1968, I believe, when the lawsuit was filed. And by the time they went through, I want you to imagine, Chanda, these two Black women. My memory is bad. I wish I could remember her colleague. They were suing to get into the Graduate School of Social Work at Tulane University. She, by the way, would go on to become a legendary youth services and preschool and early education advocate and scholar and leader in the country, still based here in New Orleans. They sued the university, and the university's defense, as I read it in writing, the university's defense was, listen.
I think I already know what it is, but
you already know because you're Black in America. So Paul Tulane, the founder of Tulane University, said in the charter documents that it was originally for white boys and men, not even for women, because we don't tell that story about how women were also excluded from all these things, right? It was basically for the landed gentry who were males, white males. And then over time, women, they created a different college for women, Newcomb College, right? Similar to Harvard's Radcliffe situation. And that it was never intended for, nor was the endowment and how it had grown, was going to support the admission and education of Black students. They actually filed that in a court of law in these United States of America in 1968. And we're not talking about, 1868 or 1921 or
right,
something.
which is why I brought it up, right? Because often when I am in community and I'm in these meetings and they're like, what are we going to do? And we just got to get these parents or we just got to get these people to understand differently. And I'm often sitting here thinking, do you understand how close the history?
It's right there.
You can touch it. You can touch it in the room. You can touch it through me to my grandmother.
It's right there. People who are living.
People that are living.
People who are living. I was bought into. So the first person who taught me anything about philanthropy and grant making was Thelma Harris French, and Mrs. French was this incredible Black woman who'd been, I like to say, sort of born on Southern University's campus. Her mom worked at this amazing HBCU, and she would go on to obviously be well educated, become a social worker, and do these great things. And she was essentially what you would call today a deputy mayor for Mark Morial when he was mayor of the city of New Orleans. And I had a chance to become her assistant. And in that context, I learned how to develop community-centered and informed concepts, how to put those concepts inside of very competitive grant proposals, how to develop grant-making strategies that were equitable and highly impactful. The city had a division of federal and state programs, and it's where we really drove federal and state and private funding into communities to uplift all the things that we cared about. And in those lessons, I was taught by Ms. French primarily about how recent this history was. We would frequently work with people who were living members of the civil rights community, right? Some of those folks are still alive, Chanda, who would share with us the freedom rides that they were on, right? And what that meant for them to get their heads beat in and to not be able to get work, or for their relatives to lose their jobs, and all the other ways that they were oppressed and assaulted, right? They would share with us what it meant for the lawsuits to be filed and what was then LSUNO, Louisiana State University of New Orleans. I would get an undergraduate degree in biology from what is now the University of New Orleans. But that some of the people who were involved in filing the lawsuit to integrate UNO were still living. One of them was a professor of mine, a guy named Raphael Casimir, right, who led a civil rights organization, went on to get a PhD in history, and would become one of our most esteemed professors and historical scholars. He's still living, by the way, still active and kicking. And he was back there when those things were happening. And so, I mean, it really does go back to the point you made earlier about what does it take? What has it taken for us to even be able to sit in these seats and to be in these positions? And how do we position ourselves to understand what it takes for us to do the work that allows another generation to come behind us, but not to sacrifice our lives necessarily for it, if there's a way to not do that? I mean, I think a lot of people are wrestling with that.
I think so too. And I think to the earlier conversation that we had is that people are leaving in droves. And I think that part of the comfort, and I might be oversimplifying, and so, please add in here. But for me, there have been folks that used to stay in positions for a long time.
Yeah.
And those roles became very much part of their identity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think now our identity is more square in what we want to impact and what our contribution is. I think there's a shift.
Yep.
So I want to do it here. But if you don't want me to do it here,
hey,
I'm going to still do it over here. So there's a level of liberation and courage that's required, and understanding that what you want to do, where you do it,
yes,
can be separate.
Absolutely. Yeah, and we don't have to be bound by what I've frequently heard folks call golden handcuffs, right?
Mm-hmm.
You get a good job, you get the good benefits, and I really appreciate you bringing up the other thing that we don't talk much about, the status and the way we identify with it.
Yeah,
and how that really can be a problem, especially when people need to shift or behave differently. And I've seen that a lot in the field, unfortunately.
Yeah, I left my role last year to launch my business, and I'm a co-founder of the Black Collective Foundation. And so people kept saying, when are you going to announce where you're going next, right? So I announced my business, and I'd already I'd already announced the Black Collective, but that I was going to more squarely be in it as a co-founder in residence. And people kept saying, well, when are you going to announce? And I'm like, well, I did. Right. And I'm like, I remember thinking, oh, I see. Like, there's more value in some people's mind if I was going into a predominantly white institution in a big role.
Absolutely.
If I'm launching my own business. That is a big announcement for me to bet on myself.
It's huge. And when did we stop valuing ownership, society? Like, when did we stop valuing the ability for you to completely direct your trajectory? Like, there was a time, again, and I don't mean to be inside the trope of, oh, it's, the good old days. But we've lost the recipe, Shanda. There
Yeah.
was a time when you starting your business would have been a moment of celebration. And it probably was, I'm sure, in your circle. But it really is bizarre to me that when people stand outside of these institutions, people look at them like they're crazy.
Yeah. And I think it's because they are roles that are coveted. There's not a lot. I mean, I understand it, but I remember feeling like, yo, like womp, womp, womp. Like I was ready for the balloons, you know?
That's right.
I'm excited. But most importantly, I think that it's important for people to move
Yeah.
so that other people can move in.
Yes.
And I think that's really important. And what I think I know about your career is that I think that you succeeded Gladys Washington, who was also on this podcast.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So I have had the pleasure of succeeding two brilliant, groundbreaking Black women in philanthropy. When I came to the Louisiana Disaster Recovery Foundation, Cherise West Scantlebury, who's, Cherise, had been the president and had created this, no pun intended, extraordinary foundation of work with the likes of Ashley Shelton and Christy Wallace Slater, other Black women, sort of up and coming luminaries, if you will, in the work. And and so I had the advantage of coming in to a body of work that was already strong and significant, and the opportunity to lead in that work for 14 years, including the creation of the Foundation for Louisiana, which would not have happened if Lynetta Gilbert hadn't hired me. She was, chair of the search committee and decided to pluck me into this position. I would ask her later, why did you hire me? She said, because we were intentional. We knew we wanted someone from New Orleans or from Louisiana who had already expressed the values and the intentionality and had the skill sets. And because Thelma Harris French had set me up with those things, I was prepared. And so this theme for me of Black women making a way for me, or in some cases making me, right, is consistent. And so I will share with you that for years, even in my creation of a founding foundation for Louisiana and that amazing work, I dreamed of running the Mary Reynolds Babcock Foundation for years. And it was one of those things, Shanda, that you say, well, that'll never happen. And, can I move to Winston-Salem? I'm really anchored and attached to New Orleans. And so I never put a lot of emphasis in it. I thought, that'll never happen. And then I get the call, I get the chance to compete for the work, and I get the job. And what I know is there is so much inside of the space and place that would not exist but for, I like to call the Gladys Washington, right? Who not only brought a community grounded sense of brilliance to the work, but also was willing to do something really important that we don't talk enough about, and that is to battle for what was right, right?
Mm.
And I don't mean in some crazy kind of way, but she was going to push for and fight for things that community needed, even if her colleagues didn't necessarily understand it or didn't have an orientation around those things. And I got to see that up close and personal in my role at Foundation for Louisiana as I am watching Gladys push out some of the most groundbreaking grants that the South had ever seen, as I'm watching Gladys build a pipeline of leaders with intention and investment that are still, it's a bit of a crescendo that still reverberates inside of philanthropy, right? My successor at Foundation for Louisiana, the brilliant Charmel Galden, a Black woman from Georgia, who is doing even smarter and more innovative work than I ever knew how to do, was introduced to philanthropy through one of Gladys's leadership programs. Think about that, right? And so we talk about this in the South. We say, well, you know how small it is, or you know what, Black folk know each other, or whatever we say. That is actually the case. You have these scenarios where these women, these Black women, knew and understood the power and value of creating strong networks and doing the leadership development work and cultivating the field and taking the licks, right?
Yeah.
So that, right, so that people who came behind them, right, at Lynetta Gilbert at the Greater New Orleans Foundation and at the Ford Foundation, Gladys at the Mary Reynolds Babcock Foundation, Sharice at the Disaster Recovery Foundation, had already taken the licks so that other folks could come behind them and really do that work. And it is profound legacy work, right?
Yeah.
It's not just values laden, Chanda. It is some of the deepest and most high impact work you'll find in the field, period, anywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. And I believe wholeheartedly in the responsibility of developing and creating space for new leaders and new voices.
Mm-hmm.
There are other people that don't believe that.
All right, Chanda. Lord help us. Yeah.
Lord help us, right? But because I think that, and the reason why I'm bringing it up, because there might be somebody listening who thinks that leadership is a solo act.
Oh, God.
Right? That believes that they're competing for role, that they're competing against other people that might look like them or not look like them. And so what you are describing and what I've been able to witness through the connections that you're talking about, right, is that your ability to influence and to withstand the challenges that will come to your way, actually your capacity is expanded, right?
Yes.
That you have deeper connections and protection and thought partnership when you decide to lead in a more vulnerable, open way that allows for other people to be in space with you. And so, what would you advise anyone who feels like they are navigating tightly and they're one of maybe one or two and they're competing against the other one, or whatever the dynamic is that is allowing them to not see the beauty of connection?
Listen, I would say it is a trick of the enemy, and folk can take that any way they want, right? Because I come from old school church places. I come from and have been had the privilege of being in movement spaces. I've been inside of organized and institutional spaces, and it's all the same. The trick of the enemy is to suggest to you can do something alone. I have never seen it, right? Nor have my ears heard a scenario.
I could have finished that sentence for you. Right.
Does, right? In my career, I have no evidence. I've seen it with all of my colleagues. The truth is, what do they say about a duck on the water? You can't see the legs moving underneath. Typically, what you see, if you find someone and or an organization or a network that is successfully achieving this work of community, there are a lot of conversations. There is a lot of network building and sustaining work. There is a lot of healing and communication that's going on, right? There is a lot of battling against the reflex to go it alone because you think that's what makes sense, or you don't agree with people. That's another thing we struggle with, right? Inside of your community, I think it's critically important that we stay connected, that we strengthen our bonds, that we see that our decision making is better informed when we're making those decisions with other people. And even as a CEO, Chanda, I barely make a good decision. I'm fortunate. I have a fantastic team. I have a great board. So I have a lot of advisory capacity, even in-house. But I barely make an important decision without making 2 or 3 phone calls first.
Mm-hmm.
my team,
Yeah.
not my work team. I mean my network. My folk out in the field. Janine Lee used to be one of those people. There are many others who I could call and say, "Does this make sense?
Mm-hmm.
I'm struggling with this thing. Is it me?" Because we need to check in on around some humility also sometimes. Um, in my past career, I've had issues with trying to recognize and manage some of the baked in patriarchy that comes with being a man and living in the world. And it was me being able to go to Black women who both loved me, but who were going to hold me accountable
Mm-hmm.
to help me see and understand what that looked like and how I could intentionally um, reverse some of those reflexes or intentions, right?
Can you talk about what it looked like? Could you make it plain for the listeners on how it was showing up for you or in the work?
Yeah, so it was showing up for me as the leader of a dynamic social justice philanthropic intermediary. Translation, we're having to raise money to spend money.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so the stress of that work really had me in a frame of mind that, listen, I don't have time to deal with smaller, petty things, right? You see where that goes.
I do. Yeah.
So what then happens is the voices of your team and the things um, that they're thinking about and that they need to do the work don't get the attention they deserve. And these were mostly women of color, right?
Mm-hmm.
Black and brown women who were working their behinds off, doing really amazing things, and also struggling to do all the things required because we're having to walk on both sides of the street. And I was not showing up to give them the things that they needed. There were instances where we didn't have the things they needed, and I just assumed they understood that.
Mm-hmm.
And I was not communicating or giving any respectful narrative to what was actually going on because my ego was tied up in I'm the leader and I have to present strength, right? And that means, charge forward and all the things that come with that.
Mm-hmm.
And thankfully, some of them were willing to put their finger on it and me and say, this is a problem. This is
Mm-hmm.
an issue.
Yeah,
And
I've been around a couple women lately where they're like, "Man, I need a wife." Right? Like I'm working like these people forgot that I'm raising kids over here, right? These 7:30 meetings, these other meetings that they're operating as though the same structure that they have operates in my life,
that's right.
right?
That's right.
And so I'm in a meeting and he's saying, "Oh, my wife is picking up my kids." And I am the one that has to pick up my kids. And there's no understanding of how that translates into the expectation.
No understanding. And I would further complicate it with it's gender and it's generational.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so I'm the first one, right, to have said before, and I really have tamped this down. But well, are you kidding? Do you know how hard I worked when I was your age? Are you kidding? Do you know what I had to do when I was in your position? Right. Because I teased my team. I've had all their jobs except the CFO. Right.
Right.
Like,
Right.
I've done all the things.
I had
Um,
to walk to work and I had to, yeah, yeah. And you're complaining about the little thing. Do you know what I had to do? Yeah.
Not seeing that it was that level of suffering and patriarchy and um, that was a part of what made it so hard and why it didn't work in those
Mm-hmm.
spaces. And so for me, it was revelatory, and it was also really important for me to have folks who are willing to hold me accountable while also holding me close.
Yeah. I teach a class at the Humphrey School, the Dynamics of Public Affairs Organization. And my class that I had last week was on conflict.
Hmm.
And it was really interesting to sit with them as they were describing conflict, because the majority of them seen it as a confrontation,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? An aggressive argument, a telling off of someone. but not something where people are in disagreement or when they witness something that shouldn't be, and having an ability to have a conversation about it.
Yeah.
Right. And to find ways to do it healthy. And many of the ways in which we see our ability to either be disclosing or the way in which we approach stuff has so much to do with how we were raised.
Yeah.
And sort of the water we've been swimming in. Right. And so the class was, what do we need to unlearn about what it means to provide and offer good feedback?
Yeah.
Right. And to do that in a way that is direct and with the person. Right. And with understanding and empathy.
I think it's really powerful. It's astonishing that you're teaching that class because it's a practical thing that people need in these spaces that folk rarely get. We at the Mary Reynolds Babcock Foundation, we have a commitment to learning. Mm-hmm. And so the way that's starting to be translated in the 18 months I've been there is at the staff level in particular. We have been having staff retreats that are tuned to our commitments around racial equity and power building. And by extension, Chanda, our understanding of power and power dynamics and how we wield power internally. So we're attempting to live our values internally the way we express them externally. Mm-hmm. And it has required us to be inside of deep spaces of discomfort, right? So when conflict comes up, some of it around race, some of it around gender, some of it around power, a hierarchy, we find we haven't had the training or the experience to know how to affirmatively move through it in the way that you're describing. Mm-hmm. And so we recently had a conflict understanding and resolution workshop, which was transformative. To be clear, it's a journey and a beginning for us. Yeah. But I had a few folks come back to me afterwards and say, wow, so instead of us just avoiding the thing and watch it come up 6 months later and explode inside of some crisis, we're intentionally facing in and learning tools, ways for us to think and imagine about not only how we create brilliant ideas and grant making and investment strategies, but also how do we manage conflict? That's right. Because I said, it doesn't go anywhere. It's just sitting there waiting. It's metastasizing. It's creating toxicity, and then it's gonna combust. That's right. It's right. And that's when people see that as the conflict. No, the conflict started over here when it was manageable, and avoidance is not a strategy. It is a strategy. It's not a healthy strategy. And we're learning from the field. Like the best thing philanthropy can do, I think, and I've always seen this in different parts of my career, is if we're tuned to the community and are paying attention to what the ground is saying, and then find ourselves shaping our work to serve that interest. And one of the things we've seen in the field, we had a retreat last week, and one of our grantee partners has co-EDs, this Black woman and this white man, and they were talking about the conflict resolution and political education training they have when you first get hired, and as a part of the institutional commitment to managing their racial justice work at the staff and board level. So they're training for it out the gate, Chanda. That's smart. Knowing that there is going to be a conflict. And they said to us, I mean, it was just so brilliant, and it really elevated our understanding of the work. They said, we know it's going to come up, and therefore we have to have the tools the same way we would for the way we think about our organizing work, or the way we think about it's work or anything else. Yeah. I mean, it's inherent in the work. It's inherent in the work. So why wouldn't we do that? And so we're baking some of that in. And I think, and maybe that's an answer to your earlier question about what does it look like when you're inside of these organizations and you're struggling to have impact, instead of just surrendering to the organizational culture. maybe there's some way for folks to start to build a different kind of culture internally.
Right.
That work on around conflict.
Mhm. We just have a few more minutes, but I have to bring up the fact that I was just at the Whitney plantation,
Oh yeah.
and I'm a chair of a board, and decided that I wanted to bring the board there,
Yes.
because there's times in governance that you can get very focused on the tactics of an organization, or you can get stuck on a moment, or you can get stuck on a future without understanding and being grounded in the same way.
Well,
So I wanted to go there. It was not an easy decision. And for everyone on the board, it wasn't a comfortable decision.
yeah.
Um, but it was an amazing experience for me, right? I'm from Minnesota. My maternal side, fourth, fifth generation here.
Yeah. Wow.
To be there and hear the narrative from the enslaved perspective,
Mhm.
and to be with people that want the same thing, but have different experience in how they relate to the thing,
Yeah. Absolutely.
which means that we're going to think differently about what we're trying to achieve together until we can find a unified way, right? Even if we have different sides, but let's come to some shared understanding. And so I believe in the power of governance when done well,
Hmm.
right? It's one of the opportunities for impact inside of the ecosystem. It's not the only, but I believe that when done well, it can really support an organization, a team, and the leader of doing its best work.
It's a brilliant representation of, I guess, a kind of historical construct, right? This Whitney plantation, um, the the accuracy of the curation, the understanding of what it means for people to visit and be able to take something away from it is significant. I think the thing I've been a few times, obviously, and my board has been. They visited Whitney right before I came on. Um, I think in 22, maybe 21. And I recently took them to Montgomery to the Equal Justice, Brian Stevenson's work. And it is transformative, particularly for board members who don't have the access to that information or who haven't been. I have board members who say there was so much that I've seen that I had no understanding about or didn't understand. Um, and to your point, there were others in reflection about the Whitney plantation who misunderstood the viciousness
Mhm.
and the severity of evil that was at the heart of the enslavement of humans and what it actually looked like from day to day. When we went to Montgomery, I told a story at the top of our time together. And Shonda, some of this is I'm the CEO. I need to set the tone, and I was trying to figure out what that would look like. And on the way to Montgomery, I drove from New Orleans. It's about 4 hours. I called my mama,
Mhm.
and some of it because my family's from Alabama originally, and I just said, let me call a girl and see what she's thinking. And she reminded me of a story, right? She said, "Oh yeah, well, it's just, oh man, it's so interesting to think about, Flozell, because in some ways we got to Mississippi, which is where my mom met my dad, um, because we had relatives who had to flee Alabama
Mhm.
because they'd gotten word that the local Klan or White Magnolia Society or whatever they were called was coming to get my great grandfather." I said, "Well, that's right. You did tell me that story." And I sort of pushed it back, and it made me think, Shonda, about not just the negativity of the circumstance, but the amazing ability for people, even when pushed out of their community, to find a way to re-anchor, right? My grandmother would eventually move to New Orleans with her 4 children because she had to. No friends, no family, nothing set up. And she would wash clothes. My mom was 17 when she had me and was told a bunch of things about, well, that's the end of your life and that boy will never be anything, right? And both of these Black women who were my original mentors in understanding how we think about community philanthropy and care, they were the folks you could always go to get a meal, to borrow some money, even if they didn't have it. They were going to babysit your children. They were going to care for you because they understood that's what it meant to be in community. And they understood these legacies of care that we have that continue to carry us today. Right. And and I told my board and team that story, not as a way of only saying, look how bad it was, but also as a way of showing how amazing it is that human beings have the capacity, even beyond this domestic terrorism that has been part and parcel of how this country was made and continues to prosper. And to me, that's something to look forward to. It's something that keeps me going every day. And it's something that reminds me that we have the creativity and the courage. We have the imagination and the durability to keep moving this work in all the ways that we decide to, as you pointed out.
I love that as our closing story. And what is sitting on my heart is that sometimes the narrative is that we are only the recipients of philanthropy. And this story is about how we build, how we've been in philanthropy, right? That we don't call it that way in all of the ways that we have discussed in this, right? The expansion of care and love and an extension, right? In all the ways that we have built community and built possibilities for people to break through what they're navigating, right? Collectively and individually, has been the story. It's been our story.
It's been the story. When my grandmother on my dad's side, Mama Eve, um, when she was getting close to the end of her life and she wasn't doing well, and I would ask my daddy, they're in Foxworth, Mississippi. I'd be like, what? Who are all these people coming to care for her? Like, what is this? And she'd been the church mother. My grandfather had been the head deacon of the church, um, and the story essentially was, well, she spent about 75 or 80 years looking after this community, quietly showing up for people, doing what needed to be done, right? And when there is that level of community philanthropy, as
That's
we
right.
that collective care is always going to come back, and that's a power that we have. That's a source of strength that I think has been really important.
Legacy. Legacy is not about a title.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Not about a title. This I could literally talk to you for like another hour, and but I cannot.
No,
And I appreciate you so much. This has just been a delight. Um, thank you for all that you've contributed, and thank you for weaving in the stories of Black women who you said they birthed you in philanthropy, right? They cared for you, they nurtured you.
right.
And then to end with the literal people that birthed you, in terms of your grandmother and your mama, and it's just a beautiful sort of tapestry of the ways in which we show up.
Yeah.
Right. And the legacy of all of the people that you mentioned. And I love that you said their names because it's important that we say the names of people that have given to us and give to others.
Yeah. I had no idea, Chanda, that I had these legacies until I got older and could recognize them. I'm deeply grateful. I'm grateful for you and for the immaculate Toya Randall.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being on Centering Conversations.